Alright guys, this is my simple tutorial on how to properly solder your Pancake and pedalboard cables. So what I've got here, I've got all my fun little things. I have a Weller soldering iron. I think Weller makes a really good soldering iron. This one happens to have a base with controllable voltage, which allows you to control the heat. But you could make do with a simple soldering iron from Weller that doesn't have any of that fancy stuff. I will say though that I find that the kind of flat tip end, like a flathead screwdriver style end, works really well in these circumstances, and I'll demonstrate that in a little bit. I also like this particular little Hacko, whatever it's called, tip cleaner for soldering iron. It does a really good job to keep the tip nice and clean as you're working. Just be careful not to burn yourself. It's a little simpler than using a sponge, I think. I have Radio Shack 6040 rosin core solder. It's 0.032 diameter. I really like this stuff. It's inexpensive. You can get it at almost any Radio Shack. It's nice and thin, very easy to work with. It's very malleable. So I have that as well. I have a flathead screwdriver to attach and tighten up the screws for the enclosure ends, for the Pancake ends. These Pancake ends are Switchcraft, co-designed by Lava Cable. Now what Lava Cable decided they wanted to help with was to provide a way to better insulate the cable ends, the soldered ends and everything, from the top of the enclosure, because you run the risk here of the wire connections actually shorting against the back of this. So what they did is they had this little plastic flap. So when you put it on, it fits in just like that, and it shields it from the back so you don't short out the cable. I thought that was quite ingenious of them. And it's actually on redco.com, which is where I got the Switchcraft plugs and the Mogami cable. I love this Mogami cable. You can get it on Redco. It's very inexpensive per foot. It's less than, I think it's less than 45 or even 40 cents per foot. It's really affordable. But these Switchcraft co-designed by Lava plugs on redco.com are actually less expensive, if I remember correctly, than the standard Switchcraft plugs. And with that little insulation flap, it's really handy, really useful. I also have my wire stripper. This one goes from a 10 gauge all the way to a 22 gauge. We're going to use 10 gauge today to strip off the first layer from the Mogami cable here, but then we'll also use the 20 gauge one right here, the second to last one, to do the very interior hot wire that's inside the Mogami cable. Last but not least, this is the thing that a couple of the guys on the board were really wondering how to do, was to keep these plugs in place. How do I keep that in place? Right here, Behringer CT100 cable tester. Tests all kinds of cables. I mean, it does 1/8 inch, it does MIDI, it does TT, whatever the heck that is, it does RCA, it does XLR, and it does 1/4 inch. That's the main thing that we're going to be concerned with, because not only is it a very good tester, especially for the price, $30 on Amazon. I mean, you can't beat that. It's a great price, and it works really well. It uses a single 9-volt battery in the back. So not only is it going to test your cable, but once I plug my cables in, these puppies ain't going nowhere. They're right where I need them to be. The ends are facing up. It's all good. So now I'm going to get started. I'm going to make just a generic length of cable here. The way it's going to work is I'm going to determine my length by having the cable end in the center of whatever plug it's going to go into. So wherever your pedal is on your board, let's say this is your pedal, so it's on the board, and you want it to be that length, so I'm going to measure it there. The center is what you're going to be concerned about, because the center of the plug is right where it's going to be connected. See that? So, for argument's sake here, I'm just going to pretend I've done my measuring. Hey, there it is. So I know that length is there, so now I want to get the other length end. And I'm just going to make a generic size here. So I'm just going to take my little wire stripper that also has the scissor end. Don't catch your finger in there. I've done it before. I thought I completely mashed up my ring finger one day and it really hurt. So word to the wise, don't do that. So I'm going to set that down. I'm not going to need it for, actually I'll need it in just a second. So I'm going to pick it back up again. Alright, here we go. So now what I want to do is determine how much of the outer shield I need to remove. So I'm going to place it in place, and I want probably about down to the enclosure screw holes. So I see it's about that much, so I'm going to take my thumbnail and kind of mark where it needs to be, about right there, and then I'm going to look at it. And on that 10 gauge, I'm going to just gently but firmly cut. I'm not going to twist. I'm just going to do the cut, and then I'm going to pull away like that and get rid of the excess piece. So now I've got all the shielding here. What I'm going to do with this is I'm going to wrap it all around so it's pointing around to the same side. And there's some shorn pieces here as well, so I'm going to be careful to make sure I grab those as well, because those will short out as well. And once I have them all going in the same direction, I'm going to twist. So that is going to bundle them all together and make them a lot easier to work with. The other thing I'm going to do, in order to make it easier to get the two connections going from this terminal for hot and this one for ground, I'm going to take my index finger and I'm going to kind of bend it like that. So that way, once it's in place, everything's right where it needs to be. Nice and clean. It's actually a little bit long, so I may trim off a couple of the ends just a little bit, but I'll wait till after I've soldered to do that. First I'm going to trim off the end there. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my wire stripper again, and I'm going to use that second to last section, the 20 gauge. I'm going to put it on the interior end, right there. I'm going to strip off. I'm going to move that a little bit out of the way so I don't mess it up. I'm going to put that around there. I'm going to strip that. So now I have silver end right there, all the wiring there. I'm not going to worry about twisting those, okay? But I am going to kind of bend that back into place where it needs to be. So I'm going to see that's approximately how it's going to fit. I will trim the shielded section down, the grounding section down, but I'm going to do that after I tin the wire. So what I'm going to do to tin the wire is going to take my solder. I'm going to hold it at an angle so you can see. It's nice and malleable, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to point it straight up. So that way when it's sitting down, solder is right here ready for me to work with. Okay, instead of it being all the way down here, it's standing straight up as if someone's holding it for me, because I don't need to touch that. What I need to do is put the solder onto these ends so they're nice and coated, and it's also going to make them really solid. They're not going to be very malleable. So try to make sure that it's positioned the way that you want it. So I'm going to see right there, yeah, that's probably about good. So now I'm going to take my soldering iron, clean it. I'm going to carefully apply heat to the solder tip here of the actual solder and to the wire end, and it's going to draw the solder onto the wire and tin it. It'll coat it, it'll saturate it, and it'll be nice and solid and help create a good connection. And it doesn't take much, it's just a little whoop and you're done. So there's that end. You can't really see it all that well, but it's a little bit shinier now. I'm going to do the same thing for the shielded end. Here we go. It's going to take a little more to do the shielding section. The ground. I keep calling it the shield. It's actually the ground. So now that's nice and tinned up. I'm done with the soldering iron for now, so I'm going to clean it. I'm going to put it back into the holster. And again, I'm going to just take my little trusty unit here and trim off that little bit of extra end that I had because it was a little too much. So now I'm ready to actually attach the wire to the plug. So what I'm going to do is get the soldering iron again, dab it onto the solder to get just a little bit on there that I'm going to work with. And I'm going to insert the hot end into the hole of the terminal for the hot end. Okay, so there we go. Probably about that much. You don't want it to stick out too far or it will short against the enclosure. So now that I have the solder on the tip of the iron, I'm going to just place it against the terminal and everything will heat up, and now I have a nice solid connection. You see it's not moving. So now this right here is where this flat tip end really comes in handy, because this is the part that most of you guys that I've read on the board have had an issue with, and that is getting the ground wiring to stay in place. Tinning it is really going to help, but also having this flathead would help because it instead of it being a point, the fact that it's flat, I'm able to use it more as a blunt edge to help push the wiring down where it needs to go. So I'm going to do the same thing. Put a little bit of solder on the tip, press down on it against that other solder terminal, leave it there for a moment, and I'm going to examine that. Looks pretty good. Now one thing you want to avoid doing is blowing on the solder. You don't need to blow on the solder to get it to cool. It'll cool on its own naturally and it'll do it very quickly. If you blow on it, you run the risk of creating what's called a cold solder, which is basically the molecules didn't cool properly, they didn't align right, so there's not a good solid connection of all the solder being in place. It's kind of, the way its molecular structure is now put together is really kind of malformed. So now that that end is done, now I have this other end to do. So I'm going to once again measure about how much I need. About right there, so about that much. I'm going to take my cutter and I'm going to strip it using that 10 gauge spot right about there. Pull it away. Don't need that anymore. So now I've got my grounding wires. I'm going to run them all over to the same side. Make sure to grab them all. Okay, I have them all, and now, yeah, there's a couple on the other side. That'll be all right. Wrap them around, and again, I'm going to twist. Twist them into position. Just like that. And then, you know what, while I'm here, I'm going to go ahead and trim that little bit of end off of the top piece. So with that 20 gauge for this particular gauge wire, double check which gauge you're going to need for the kind of wire you get. Again, I like this particular Mogami cable because it's high quality, it's inexpensive, it's durable, it's malleable, and the tone quality that you yield from it is excellent. So now I am done with this, I think, so I'm going to set this right here just in case I need it again. So now, again, I'm going to take my finger and kind of bend that end up into place right where I need it. And I'm going to double check that it's correct by placing it over the actual plug. Yeah, that looks good. So now I'm going to do the same tinning procedure again. I'm going to take my soldering iron, clean it, and tin the wire. So I'm going to apply heat to the very end of the wire and touch the other end of that little bare exposed piece of wire to the solder, let it heat up, and let that solder just naturally draw itself onto the wire. Now doing this, tinning the wire will take practice. So, you know, get some old wire that you don't care about and practice. Just try seeing how it is drawing up that solder onto the end. That's what I did when I learned from a luthier up in in North Florida at this vintage guitar shop that I got to work at for a while. I learned a whole bunch of cool things about guitar repair and soldering, everything like that from him. And this is probably one of the most valuable lessons that I learned from him, was the proper way to tin your wiring. It just makes it so much easier to get all your connections good to go. So now that's pretty much good to go. I'm going to get a little more solder on there. I'm going to apply the heat to the soldering end. Actually, there's a little too much. Let me take some of that off there. That's better. I'm going to apply the heat to terminal end and insert. And that's now nice and secure. You see that? And now I'm going to do the same thing on this end. Now this wire is kind of moving all over the place a little bit. So this again is where having this flathead tip style tip of the soldering iron really comes in handy, because I'll be able to just force it down, just push it down right where it needs to go, right into place. And you can steer it a little bit with your other hand that's holding the wire in place. I might need a little more solder here, so let's get a little more solder. Ooh, don't breathe in those fumes, boy. There we go, that's better. So now that connection looks a whole lot better. So, now what I'm going to do is turn on my cable tester, see what's what. Look at that. The way I know everything is correct is, you see I kind of have the, there, now you can see it. You see how it has the 5 dots there on the squares on the right? Basically what those are showing is that it's shorting at those particular points. And that's the configuration that you're going to want. I'm not going to go into the whole explanation of the shorting versus not. If you want to know how that works, you can figure it out yourself, whatever. I just know that when I see those 5 little squares, not 5 squares, those 5 points, I'll hit that, that'll be easier to see. When I get that look, the 4 corners and then the one in the middle out of the 9 that are there, that's when I know the cable has been soldered correctly. You can double check it. I highly recommend actually to double check it into your amp. Just kind of plug one end into the amp and then with the other one touch your thumb against the tip, you know, just kind of do this kind of deal to it. And then you should hear the bzz, bzz, bzz of the amp, because basically you're shorting the cable. But that is exactly what you want right there. You want that view of those 5 dots right there.